The reveal of Assassin's Creed 4 was met with mixed reception. On the one hand, pirates are cool, and there aren't a lot of pirate games out there, especially back then. But on the other hand, pirates don't exactly scream Assassin's Creed, and AC3's lackluster launch was only a few months in the past at that point. We were getting a game centered around the last entry's most niche mechanics only 1 year after it failed to impress fans worldwide. I mean, Black Flag was set up for failure in basically every way. And that's what made it so surprising that at launch and in the decade that followed, AC4 became among the most celebrated of Assassin's Creed games. How did that happen? How did they take shaky mechanics and what was already a tired, overarching narrative and build something that would win back the affection of its increasingly jaded fanbase? Well, personally, I would argue that a lot of its success is inseparable from its most common criticism, that it isn't a real Assassin's Creed game. Now, personally, I don't agree with that assessment, but I get where people are coming from when they say it. Sailing to uncharted islands throughout the Caribbean and shelling Spanish forts feels like a far cry from the deliberate investigation and assassination gameplay loop introduced in AC1. But while AC4 may not fall neatly into certain people's preconceptions of what Assassin's Creed is, I believe it uses that distance from the other games to deconstruct what the franchise is actually about. Where some games recycle the same repetitive open-world content regardless of the historical setting, everything you do in AC4 is tailored to experiencing the Caribbean of the 1700s. Where some games cram in as many historical figures as they can for name recognition alone, AC4 turns real people into dynamic, fleshed-out characters in the story. And where some games slap the Assassin and Templar labels on an otherwise cookie-cutter black-and-white narrative about good and evil, AC4 is actually interested in exploring the philosophies of these groups far more than many games where you do play as a traditional assassin. Now, through all that, I do want to make it clear. AC4 is not some underrated gem that needs me to come to its defense. It is by far one of the most popular games in the series. And likewise, there's no objective answer to what makes a game a real or good Assassin's Creed game. It's entirely valid to feel that Black Flag's story and gameplay loop miss what you love about the series. All I'm doing is providing my own perspective here. That of someone who believes that AC4 is not just a great game, because it is, but also a game that thoroughly and respectfully presents some of the franchise's core themes in ways that even the purest of AC titles fall short of achieving. And so here's my take on the big question. Is Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag a good pirate game, but a bad Assassin's Creed game? Well, determining its quality as an AC game requires a level of nuance, and we're going to talk about that more. But the other half of that question is a lot easier to answer. AC4 remains, in my opinion, the best pirate game of all time. There are a ton of open-world historical fiction games out there, and it sucks when a cool time period is wasted on a game with the same collectible hunts and fetch quests as the rest of the genre, leaving the setting as nothing more than a glorified backdrop. That's not a problem here. Every aspect of the content and mechanics in AC4 are built around taking full advantage of the golden age of piracy as a setting. And that begins with the open world, which offers so many period-appropriate locales to explore. Dense, atmospheric jungles, fishing villages, Mayan ruins, deserted islands, deep-sea shipwrecks, and some of the most beautiful locations I've ever. These are on top of the Spanish city of Havana, reminiscent of the Ezio trilogy in its size and structure, the English colony of Kingston, more reminiscent of the Dutch architecture of AC3, and the squalid pirate haven of Nassau. All of these regions are bolstered by the game's massively improved graphics when compared to its predecessor. While AC3 was plagued by muted, milky textures, Black Flag's world is full of intricate detail and vibrant color. Tanned skin and worn clothing look appropriately rough and grubby, while the bright blues and greens and yellows of a tropical sunny day are portrayed so accurately I can almost feel the salt baking into my skin. In contrast to cheery Caribbean afternoons, the dynamic weather system is back with a vengeance, and storms that would be an annoyance on land become life or death at sea, as the player is left dodging sea spouts, rogue waves, and unwieldy winds. It does a great job of showcasing the danger of this setting, presenting a world players must adapt to and respect. Brian Tyler's soundtrack completes this immersion with music that could have been pulled right out of Pirates of the Caribbean for all the untrained ear could tell, while still retaining enough of its own identity to feel distinct. But if we are being honest, these tracks are not what people remember most about the music in Black Flag.
Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Tomorrow ye will get your pay, and it's time for us to leave her.
Ask anyone who has played this game, everyone has a favorite sea shanty. They take otherwise nameless and mostly faceless crew members and give them a sense of camaraderie that makes them feel real. There is more to being a pirate in this game than chaotic, explosive ship battles. Singing with your crew to pass the time on long, calm voyages at sea matters just as much to that pirate fantasy. All this to say that the world of AC4 Black Flag looks and sounds perfect in its recreation of the Caribbean of the 1700s. That said, all of it would fall flat if it wasn't actually fun to sail. But while plenty of games have tried to replicate the magic of AC4's gameplay, future Ubisoft games included, none have ever come close when it comes to this naval aspect. The devs masterfully toe that line between making sailing a 1700 ship both realistic and fun. Your speed dips just far enough into fantasy for the gameplay to feel fast-paced and exciting, while remaining deliberate and strategic enough to still feel like you're sailing a ship and not drifting on a sports car. The Jackdaw's arsenal is expansive enough to give you plenty of options for the 50-hour runtime of the game. Weapons mounted to the front and back of the ship for tailing or fleeing, the mortar for ranged combat, a ram if you want to make things more personal, both standard and heavy shot cannons on either side, and the swivel guns to keep your hands busy while your crew lines you up to board an enemy ship. And you really do need to use all these tools if you want to succeed in this game, because while I wouldn't say the naval combat is especially hard per se, there is a marked challenge in the gameplay loop that mirrors Edward's own narrative motivations for being a pirate. While an old-school AC protagonist was essentially unkillable from the start of the game on land, the Jackdaw is different. You start with a weak hull and a paltry set of cannons, and all you can really hope to beat is a few gunboats and schooners, and you'll be turning tail at the first sight of a brig or a frigate. Just like Edward, you need money and resources if you want to move up in this world. And so you're incentivized to track down and pillage the ships that give you the best loot, and with every prize you are one step closer to being the most powerful force in the Caribbean. It is a wonderful feeling the first time you fire on a massive man-of-war and realize you are taking these behemoths down as easily as you did the simple brigs at the start of the game. I do not think difficulty is a necessity in games, but the challenge provided by the naval combat pushes you as a player to take and take like a true pirate, so your Jackdaw can keep up with any threat. As a result, while you do get your own little pirate hideaway partway through the game, your real Monteregione in AC4 is the Jackdaw. It is your home, it is incredibly customizable to make it feel more personal to each player, and keeping it constantly upgraded and stocked on ammo is far more beneficial than any upgrades you can actually give Edward himself. Now, everything I've talked about here with regards to naval combat has been stuff that was brand new to AC4, but the game is also really clever in how it reuses mechanics from previous games and repurposes them for a pirate setting. While the last several AC games saw you playing as the leader of a local brotherhood, in charge of recruiting assassins to the cause yourself, Edward isn't high on anyone's pecking order but his own. Instead of recruiting disenfranchised civilians put upon by the powers that be to fight for a higher cause with the assassins, you're recruiting them to fight for themselves as pirates on your crew. The notoriety system of previous games comes in the form of pirate hunters who track you down with their eye-catching red sails. Instead of missions where you send your assassin recruits across the world, you have Kenway's fleet, where you can send a ship to trade abroad, and instead of the danger of being struck down by a Templar, that danger comes from the natural threat of combat on the high seas. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about the sailing and naval combat, and those things really can carry a game all on their own. But for the sake of discussion, what if you get bored of that? Well, maybe you find a message in a bottle, or a map with an X marking buried treasure. Maybe you try to take a load off and end up in a barroom brawl. Maybe you bust out the harpoons and go whaling. Maybe you lead an attack on a fort. Maybe you take a diving bell to the bottom of the sea to explore an old shipwreck. Maybe you find a bandit hideout in a hidden cave. Maybe you want to go hunting for crafting materials, or loot a plantation, or accept a naval contract for extra cash. Maybe you even want to go out and fight one of this game's super bosses, high difficulty encounters that each have their own specific gimmick and strategies for taking them down, with a level of depth and challenge beyond anything this series had ever attempted before. It would have been so easy for Black Flag to just settle into that tried and true formula, take down some enemy camps, grab some collectibles, uncover every icon on the map. It commits to letting the player do absolutely everything they could possibly want in this given historical setting, more so than any other game in this series. In fact, I actively believe that the only games that match AC4 when it comes to respectfully and lovingly portraying any point in history are the Red Dead games and maybe Ghost of Tsushima. To use a tired cliche, this game really does make you feel like a pirate. Short of setting up a medical area below deck to treat scurvy, I am legitimately at a loss for anything this game is missing in the pirate fantasy. And all of that has to be established before asking, is all that for the better? I've spent all this time talking about a gameplay loop that has nothing to do with assassinating Templars, dozens of side activities that involve zero stealth or parkour, and a bunch of mechanics that actively had the assassin element stripped away from them to fit a pirate fantasy instead. So does this game's home run success as a pirate game come at the cost of its ability to be a good Assassin's Creed game? Now, before I dig into this question, I want to start by saying I don't believe there's any one template that a game needs to follow to be a quote-unquote real Assassin's Creed game. I've made some videos on this topic, but while there is this ideal version of Assassin's Creed that a lot of people might have in their heads, perhaps including a focus on social stealth, a strong presence from the assassins, and maybe open assassination missions, in practice Ubisoft has been reluctant to actually prioritize a lot of these components as early as AC2. A lot of these games like to check off all the right boxes on paper, but when you look past the surface level, they barely engage with the things that make Assassin's Creed unique. The Brotherhood oftentimes barely gets fleshed out, social stealth has been underdeveloped for pretty much the whole series, and in a lot of these games you barely even stealth assassinate anyone at all, at least in the main story. Because of that, I actually feel like Black Flag is more respectful and thorough in presenting these core aspects of AC when I look under the hood than many entries people see as more traditional. Let's take one of the biggest components that gets criticized in AC4, the fact that you don't play as an assassin. And Edward is a pirate through and through. It is an objective fact that AC4 does not lean into being an assassin for most of the story. And that brings up a very legitimate criticism of the franchise that started here with this game, which is a focus on a main character who exists to fulfill an archetype. This game marked a shift away from just playing as an assassin to giving players the opportunity to roleplay as a certain type of character, whether that be a Viking or a Spartan or, in this case, a pirate. Ubisoft has consistently struggled with balancing being an assassin with fulfilling these archetypes, as I have noted in my reviews of games like Valhalla and Shadows, where I felt like that balance was handled in a pretty clunky way. But while I do believe that criticism is worth putting out there, I actually think that AC4 handles it in a way that works in the game's favor. The decision to make Edward a third party, neither assassin nor Templar, allows the narrative to flesh out the motivations of both organizations in a more nuanced way than most of these games get to. In the Ezio trilogy, for example, as much as I love it, the ins and outs of the freedom versus order philosophy don't matter that much because the assassins are simply the good guys and the Templars are, in contrast, the bad guys. This man killed Ezio's uncle and is trying to conquer all of Europe using his mind control ball, so yeah, we're gonna stop this guy. Not a whole lot of gray area there. But in AC4, the assassins are not the main protagonists, nor are the Templars really the main antagonists. Instead of some world-conquering threat, the Templars of AC4 enact a Snowden-esque global surveillance scheme that Edward has no personal stake in stopping, really, outside of any money he might be able to get out of it. The game builds up to Edward deciding to fight with the assassins, not because they're simply the good guys or because he was born into it or the Templars killed his parents or something, but because he believes in the freedom of choice advocated for by the Brotherhood. While being a pirate and being an assassin may seem dissonant on paper, the game meshes them in a way that explores the creed more deeply than we usually get to see. That pirate philosophy of personal liberty above all else, and the slow death of the pirate republic in Nassau, are used as foils against the philosophy of the assassins. Edward's years-long journey to understand that nothing is true and everything is permitted is a call to shoulder responsibility, not run from it, lies at the core of this game's narrative. Even accounting for the greatest of Ezio's speeches, I don't think any other AC game so successfully deconstructs the themes of Assassin's Creed as Black Flag. But no matter how much time I spend talking about ideals and themes, at the end of the day, it would be weird to play an Assassin's Creed game without the assassins showing up much. But the thing is, the assassins get way more screen time in this game than a lot of the other ones. I've complained in some videos about the franchise's unwillingness to actually feature assassins in Assassin's Creed, instead usually giving us stories where the Brotherhood was wiped out, or the protagonists are going rogue, or the assassins just don't even exist yet. In AC4, they are an organization in their prime. We see that they number far beyond any game since AC1, with the clearest organizational structure and hierarchy since AC1 as well. You have Atabai as mentor at the top, bureau leaders overseeing operations in each region, and field agents like Mary Reed carrying out contracts. You compare all of the assassins in this game, who are real, meaningful characters, with games like Unity or Revelations where, despite being seen as more traditional AC games, you get one, maybe two assassins who have any memorable screen time. And so the assassins are fleshed out in both ideology and as individuals, but how much do you, the player, actually get to be an assassin? Well, honestly, a very respectable amount. My favorite assassin-focused content in this game are the Templar hunts, which are 4 optional story arcs which see Edward rendezvous with the bureau leader of a region to help them assassinate a local Templar. And these are incredibly high-quality missions, with full cutscenes and 4 missions per arc, giving us 16 total. These missions are, in essence, a wonderful callback to the first Assassin's Creed game in their structure. In fact, if you just isolated these 16 missions into their own mini Assassin's Creed game, it would be a closer experience to AC1 than any other entry from that PS3 era. In addition to these, you have the 30 assassination contract missions, which are a major return to form after AC3, because while that game had you walk up to an NPC and have a handful of enemies spawn on your map without any dialogue or fanfare, in AC4 we return to bespoke missions with their own stories. We also have the Mayan Stella puzzles, which aren't the most engaging content in the world in my opinion, but fill that series tradition of unlocking an ancient assassin armor set for those who want to go find that. Speaking of actually being an assassin, another thing I've pointed out about the old games is how rare it was to actually stealth assassinate a lot of your main targets. I noted in past videos how only a few targets in AC2 are killed stealthily, and 0 actual Templars are in Revelations, while in AC3 it's only the first 2 of your targets. Meanwhile, a vast majority of Edward's main targets get a somewhat open stealth mission tied to them. By my count, you have Ducasse, Prims, Chamberlain, Vane, the duo of Burgess and Cockram, Hornigold, and Rogers that get these at least somewhat open stealth sequences, which is comparable to the number of main targets Ezio killed stealthily in his entire trilogy. And so you have a game that respects the assassins more than almost any other entry, has some of the best assassin-focused content in the series, and actually lets you stealth assassinate most of your main targets, which, weirdly enough, was a rarity. Is this me saying that this is the true sequel to AC1, that AC2 failed to be or something like that? No, I'm not saying that. No matter how much cool sneaking and stabbing you do, it doesn't change the fact that you spend half your time at the very minimum blowing up ships and spearing sharks. And that's why I fully understand why AC4 just isn't Assassin's Creed enough for some people. But while I do understand that, I think it's undeniable that AC4 gets Assassin's Creed. While so many games in this series slap a hood and a hidden blade on the main character and say, this is an assassin, only to give them a by-the-books revenge story anyways, where the assassins don't even matter, AC4 digs into what it means to be an assassin, both in the lore and in the gameplay. And when you compile all of these things, you're left with an experience that, in my opinion, pirate content or not, respects the roots of this franchise more than almost any other Assassin's Creed game. We're 20 minutes into this video, and I've offered almost only praise throughout. And if you keep up with my content, that might actually confuse you, because a few months ago, I called AC3 the most disappointing game I've ever played. And how can I love AC4, but consider AC3 a massive disappointment when, from a core gameplay perspective, they're pretty much identical? And the honest truth is that if AC4 were the game that came out right after the Ezio trilogy instead of AC3, I wouldn't hold Black Flag in nearly as high esteem as I do now. I made it clear in my AC3 video that I saw almost every aspect of the core gameplay in that game, from combat to stealth to parkour, as watered down from the prior games, and AC3 took the brunt of my displeasure at that. And while AC4 is a much better game than its predecessor, in my opinion, that core gameplay is still built on those same bones. I think a huge reason why the flaws that this game shares with AC3 are easier to overlook than in that game is that the presentation in Black Flag is comparatively immaculate. There were times that AC3 looked like a Eurojank fan game with how ugly and sluggish its menus were and how janky and unfinished a lot of the content felt. But immediately upon booting up AC4, it feels like a professional AAA game. The UI is intuitive and responsive, the menus are far less busy and cluttered, and the loading screen doesn't flashbang you when you try to start the game. While AC3 was plagued by constant animation and visual glitches in almost every scene, AC4 is very visually consistent. And I already talked about how content in AC3 felt rushed and low effort at many points, while every side activity in AC4 felt like it got a sizable chunk of the budget dedicated to it. You can tell they're not cutting corners here compared to the last game. Now let me be clear, that does not mean AC4 is polished, because it is not. This game is absolutely full of little glitches throughout the entire experience. Inputs regularly don't register correctly, enemies getting ejected to the moon isn't uncommon, and plenty of people have documented the experience of their ship just rising out of the underworld randomly. I mean, the Kenway Saga was always shaky when it came to that kind of thing, and while AC4 is by far the most polished of that trilogy, it is subject to a lot of the same flaws that cannot be ignored. And these flaws extend beyond glitches and bleed into the core gameplay. And my personal least favorite part of Black Flag is the combat. Like most of the land-based gameplay, the combat is taken almost verbatim from AC3, which means I have almost all the same problems with it. I do talk more at length about my issues with this combat system in my video on that game, but I'll give a rundown here. You have the same attack, break defense, counter, and tool buttons as AC3, and like every game since Brotherhood, fighting revolves around the chain kill system, where pressing attack immediately after killing an enemy will almost always let you kill the next one in a single hit. It is a very visually appealing system because you are essentially chaining one beautifully choreographed finisher animation after another. If you are integrating tools like your guns and the rope dart into combat and utilizing the double kill mechanic, Kenway Saga combat can look really fantastic. But while it can look great in a YouTube compilation, I maintain the belief that combat in AC3, and by extension AC4, is both a visual and mechanical downgrade over the Ezio trilogy. What I loved about combat in the first 4 AC games was how grounded and seamless it felt. Back then, almost every attack would be met with a block or a deflect, and your sword wouldn't touch flesh until the killing blow. But in AC4, you hack away at your opponent's body like any other action game. The slow, methodical movements of the early games was replaced by this comical-looking shuffle that you do in combat, and while the animations themselves are excellent, transitions between them are much choppier than the Ezio trilogy. Now, in all fairness, those older games were pretty shallow. I can understand sacrificing some visual flair for the sake of added depth, but the problem is the Kenway Saga combat is the shallowest in the series. The somewhat skill-based counter was replaced by this much uglier slow-motion thing that gives you 3 to 4 business days to pull off. The combo system that rewarded perfectly timed strikes with an instant kill was gone after AC2. There is no more sidestep dodging, no more lock-on system to precisely control your combat stance, no more throwing sand to distract enemies, no more grabbing and taking hostages. I mean, AC4 in many ways is the culmination of half a decade of this series just stripping away depth from its combat systems. And while earlier games had enemies like Borgia Captains and Janissaries that required a little more strategy to kill, by the time you reach AC4, the lack of combat options means that fighting is based almost entirely around memorizing which instant kill combo will work for which enemy. and even the hardest enemies can be toppled in 2 button presses. In fact, while this is almost identical to what we had in AC3, this is where we start to see why combat is the one category where I think AC4 actually is a full step down. Black Flag has even fewer enemy archetypes than the last game, and while the animations in AC3 remain some of the best in the industry, combat looks a lot tamer and more repetitive in AC4. This is due partly to the fact that while AC3 let you choose from a wide variety of weapons, AC4 forces Edward to stick with his default dual swords, hand-to-hand, or hidden blades. You can pick up axes, muskets, and single-hand swords, but you can't keep them on your person, which is just bizarre. Now, I wouldn't say this is the worst combat in the series, it's certainly not the one I've had the least fun with, but I would say it's by far the easiest and the shallowest, and in this franchise that really is saying something. It presents an interesting dichotomy between the naval combat and the land-based combat, because while you are constantly upgrading your ship to be better prepared to take on higher-level enemies at sea, the combat on land is almost entirely stagnant. Your first fight is going to play out pretty much the same as your last fight, and after the first 30 minutes of play, you have experienced pretty much everything this combat has to offer. Luckily, I think this is the one and only aspect of Black Flag that I think is an active step down from the previous game, because if we start talking about parkour, that is almost entirely the same, and like I said in my AC3 video, my biggest issue with the movement system it introduced was the distinct decline in player control when compared to the Ezio trilogy. The window for being able to eject in any given direction during a wall run was dramatically shortened, heavily reducing the utility of that mechanic. Ledge grab was moved from a button to the stick, making it far less precise, and overall cancelability and player agency was just gutted. Parkour in AC4 can look really fantastic, but like with the combat, these animations were toned down a bit from the last game. Edward just doesn't have that same power in his movements as Ruduna. But on the other hand, I thought that the level design of Kingston and Havana was a bit more fun to traverse than Boston or New York, and parkouring between moving ships is novel for the setting, so I think it balances out with AC3. In the end, the system looks good, and you can milk some cool mechanics out of it as seen in videos like those by Jacers or Dallin S, but too much player agency was removed after the Ezio trilogy for me to really love it. It's certainly a perfectly fine parkour system, but it's not going to be one of my favorites. There is one component of AC4's gameplay that saw massive improvements, and despite all the criticisms of AC4 straying too far from its Assassin's Creed roots, that component is the stealth. And I don't just mean improvements over AC3. In my opinion, Black Flag offers the best traditional stealth experience of that PS3 era of AC. Edward's stealth toolkit is solid, whistling or throwing coins to distract, smoke bombs to obscure, and very importantly his new blowpipe, which can shoot both sleep darts or berserk darts, incredibly handy to have without falling into that Ezio trilogy trap of giving you so much ranged ammo that you almost never have to get close to your enemies. You can also get some really cool kills with the rope dart, but it comes frustratingly late in the game to be of any use, so I don't really know why they did that. The improvement that makes the biggest difference, however, is the level design. Past games maintained very simplistic stealth zones that often allowed you to walk right up to each guard and kill them one by one without much thought. But areas like plantations and smuggler camps here utilize the soft cover system and stalking zones to much better effect than AC3, letting you stay hidden at the ground level a lot more effectively than Ezio or Altair ever could. It's also worth noting that AC3's detection system was absolutely awful, and once you were seen it was common for everyone in a 2-mile radius to know your exact location. AC4 works swimmingly by comparison, which is a low bar, but an important one. To match Edward's various abilities, enemies have more tools to find you than ever. Lookout towers can spot you from seemingly a mile away, and you need to be careful about alarm bells if you don't want to alert reinforcements. Guards have lanterns and can catch you in the tall grass, and enemy density is increased far beyond the early games, incentivizing ghosting around instead of trying to kill everyone. After years of really simplistic stealth mechanics in the Ezio trilogy and the utterly broken stealth system of AC3, AC4 took bigger strides toward making AC feel like an actual stealth series than any other game had since AC1, in my opinion. However, earlier I noted that I specifically think AC4 has the best traditional stealth of the PS3 era. When I say traditional stealth, I mean your usual sneaking and stabbing, and that is contrasted with social stealth, where you are trying to hide in plain sight. It isn't really fair to say that stealth as a whole is better than previous games, because when the series started, the whole point was that you weren't sneaking around like Sam Fisher. You were a blade in the crowd. But over the course of the Ezio trilogy, we started seeing fewer social stealth missions and more linear paths with a variety of guards blocking your way just like any other stealth game. Instead of leaning into what made the series unique, AC4 further distanced itself from social stealth and leaned more into this traditional hide-and-stab experience. I wouldn't even say social stealth is bad here, it just desperately needed innovation way back in 2009, and by 2013 it was clear they were starting to give up. It felt like the team was struggling to come up with ideas for missions and set pieces that would actually utilize these mechanics, and their final decision was famously to add in a ton of tailing missions. Now, some people hate these, but I do believe they have their place. They are a great way to encourage the player to use the game's stealth tools and problem solve on the fly. But after my 10th time going from bush to crowd to bench with no real difference between any of them, given that mechanically they were all just hiding spots outside of a slightly longer invisibility grace period after leaving a crowd, I started getting frustrated that Ubisoft was continuing to waste such a novel mechanical idea without giving it the attention it deserved. And that isn't even going over the multiple ship tailing missions, which are a big, what were they thinking, part of the game. I mean, yeah, there are way too many of these on land, but at least they force you to use the social stealth tools there. You actually have to hide and sneak around. In a ship, all you can do is lumber left and right to avoid vision cones. There's nothing fun about these sections, and I really don't know why they're here. But this all still falls into the common theme of this part of the video. Many of AC4's greatest flaws are things the series was already struggling with, but not really new issues that it created. Of course, that doesn't absolve it from criticism for these issues, but it does showcase how many aspects of AC were stagnating at this point in the franchise's lifespan, contrasted against all the fresh and exciting things that AC4 was adding in. It was putting effort into the assassins. It gave us the best open-world content in the series to that point by a huge margin. It renewed its focus on stealth assassinations beyond any game since AC1, and it offered up by far the most solid traditional stealth mechanics of any of the other PS3 Assassin's Creed games. Unfortunately, it also inherited shallow combat, simplified parkour, and a fairly weak attempt at keeping social stealth alive. Things that AC3 was very much also dealing with. That, in the end, is why AC4 is my second favorite game in the series, while AC2 retains that top spot. If you take everything I've talked about so far, there is enough middling content here, mixed with the incredible stuff that this game has to offer, that if we stop the video here, it would balance out to being really good, but not excellent. But that's the thing, we aren't stopping here. AC4 is indeed an excellent game, flaws and all, in large part because of the final component that I have yet to talk about. This game's beautiful and moving approach to storytelling. I want to make my point transparent right away. I think AC4 has far and away the best narrative in this series, and it elevates my opinion of this game from seeing it as a great pirate game or great Assassin's Creed game to seeing it as one of my favorite games of all time. Before I explain why, I'll give a brief rundown of said story. Edward Kenway is a former privateer trying to make his fortune as a pirate in the Caribbean. After the ship he's a crew member of is sunk by an unknown attacker, he washes up on shore with one of his assailants. Forced to kill the man in self-defense, Edward learns his name was Duncan Walpole, and he was an assassin who intended to defect to the Templar Order and prove his loyalty by sharing the secrets of the Brotherhood. Of course, at this point in the story, this means nothing to Edward, but intrigued by the promise of a reward, Edward takes on the rogue assassin's clothes and hidden blade and finishes the delivery himself, impersonating Walpole. The ruse is short-lived and the Templars discover and jail Edward, but not before he's thrust right into the middle of the Assassin-Templar War entirely by chance. Equipped with knowledge and ancient secrets that he believes can make him as rich as he always dreamed of being as a young farmer in Bristol, Edward escapes captivity on a Spanish brig with a former slave named Adewale. Now a captain himself and a friend to neither assassins nor Templars, Edward sets off to use his newfound knowledge to find his fortune at any cost. It is at this point that we see how AC4 is structured differently from the other games in this series. Instead of focusing on a single overarching conflict from chapter to chapter, Edward's quest jumps around in many different directions. Sometimes he's helping his fellow pirates attempt to maintain the Pirate Republic in Nassau. Sometimes he works with undercover assassin Mary Read to track down a mysterious man known as the Sage, who is of unknown importance to the Brotherhood. And sometimes his prizes are all his own, not involving the assassins or Templars at all. Honestly, if you were to lay out all the events of this game in chronological order, the story they tell is certainly competent, but nothing all that special. That's because unlike the other AC games, AC4 has a decidedly character-driven story instead of a plot-driven story. I've always felt like AC4 was paced more like a book than a video game, because what carries the narrative isn't the actual events that occur, but instead the way the characters and their relationships are written. And that is where AC4 shines most, more than anything to do with the open world, or the gameplay, or anything like that. The character writing is so fantastic that it is sometimes shocking to revisit other games in this series and recall just how much they pale in comparison. What sets the characters in this game apart from those in other AC games is that they are almost all actual characters. Not plot devices, not shoehorned historical cameos, real, genuine characters. 9 times out of 10 in this series, you meet a guy like Lafayette, or Napoleon, or James Cook, but they exist to A, make you point at that guy you remember from a textbook when you were a kid, and B, tell you to go somewhere and complete a mission. AC4 doesn't work that way. If a character is in this game, there's a good chance they have their own motivations, their own unique relationships with Edward, and oftentimes their own story arcs within which they grow and change too. Ben Hornigold's seduction by the Templars after the humiliating failure of the Pirate Republic. Charles Vane's descent into madness without stronger hands to keep him in line after Blackbeard's death. Anne Bonny going from barmaid to pirate to grieving first mate. Blackbeard gets an arc, Adewale gets an arc, Mary Read gets an arc, Bartholomew Roberts gets an arc. It's mind-boggling how this game has so many fully dynamic characters when most AC games barely get one. The scene at the end of this game, when all the friends you've lost over the course of your journey are shown one final time, that scene wouldn't work in any other AC game because this is the only one where you have a dozen characters who feel like real people instead of 1, maybe 2 if you're lucky. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying every character in this game is perfect. Stede Bonnet, for example, is an endearing and important part of the early game, but he disappears less than halfway through and his off-screen death falls flat as a result. Likewise, Calico Jack is a character who has a really important role, especially given his connection to both Mary Read and Anne Bonny, for someone who gets almost no screen time. When so many of the game's characters are so thoroughly fleshed out, the ones that don't get that treatment end up standing out quite a bit. But if I had to point out a group of characters that see the most missed potential, it would be the Templars. I meant it when I said earlier that I like the less central role that the Templars play in this game, but it comes at the cost of their character development. While villains like Woodes Rogers and Governor Torres are still more nuanced than your average bad guy, they just don't get the screen time to make use of that. While some of the best moments in AC1 or AC3 are moments where the Templars get to share their side of the story, in AC4, Edward's conflict is largely internal, meaning that these characters simply don't get as much to do as in past games. They're less vile than in the Ezio trilogy, and they're less intellectually interesting than AC1, and you're left with a set of Templars that don't end up being that memorable compared to other characters in the game. The assassins also don't escape unscathed. While Mary Read is a fantastic character and acts as Edward's main contact with the Brotherhood, Atabai is kinda dull and doesn't get a lot of time to shine. I mentioned earlier that Black Flag has a lot of fun with giving you assassin-centric content, but a lot of that content is optional. Many of the best moments with assassins are found in the Templar hunts I mentioned earlier, and this game suffers from a similar issue to AC3 where the game feels almost incomplete if you don't complete some of the side content. If you don't do these Templar hunts, some of these assassins show up at the end of the game seemingly out of nowhere because it seems like Black Flag fully assumes that you've been doing these missions. While in games like AC Unity or Revelations there is a lack of meaningful assassin characters at all, in AC4 these characters are totally there, but I wish the assassins were better integrated into the main story. And that segues into a common criticism I see online, which is that many people aren't fans of the pacing of AC4. And I think those complaints are valid. The game gives you a lot of the Assassin-Templar storyline right at the start, but you go a solid quarter of the game in the middle where the focus is entirely on the Pirate Republic and the goings-on there. A big part that a lot of people dislike is that most of the Templar threat is neutralized entirely in the final chapter without a lot of build-up, as Edward rapid fires through targets one after the other. If you see this as a story about stopping the Templars or witnessing the end of the golden age of piracy, then yeah, this story is going to feel all over the place. But while I understand those criticisms, I don't agree with them. To me, those things simply aren't the point. Like I said before, this is a character-focused story, and if you see this as a story about one man maturing past his greed and desperation to become something more, then the story isn't unfocused at all. In fact, it is quite linear and straightforward. In sequences 1 and 2, we are introduced to a man whose ambition and selfishness guide his every action. In sequence 3, we see him gain the means to make good on that ambition, becoming a captain himself and learning the ropes from his peers in Nassau. In sequences 4 and 5, we see him confronted by the consequences of his actions for the first time and how he led the Templars to the assassins. We see that he is repentant and has more to him than blind ambition. We also see that he still sees everything around him as a way to make money. In sequences 6 through 8, we see the fall of the Pirate Republic, and we see how his way of life begins to crumble. And importantly, we see what fate has in store for people who follow his path if he doesn't change course.
So Thatcher's been chopped.
In sequences 9 and 10, we see him put his faith in a man even more ambitious and vile than he is, and in sequence 11, we see how that comes back to bite him. With his fellow pirates mostly dead and gone, we finally see him reflect on the kind of person he wants to be, and in sequence 12, he enacts that change, taking his first steps into becoming a true assassin. As much as I love his growth, a big part of why it's so successful is that Black Flag is uncompromisingly willing to showcase darker layers of his character. There are many flashbacks in AC4 to Edward with his first wife, a woman named Caroline Scott, whom he abandoned for his own greed and attempted to justify it with hollow promises of returning. It is so rare for these games to give us glimpses into these domestic moments like this without an action scene accompanying them. Edward leaves kindly Stede Bonnet behind when it suits him. He is directly responsible for the deaths of many assassins, and of course he's a pirate, pillaging and killing as he pleases. Even when Mary Read dies and she urges Edward to better himself, most games would have followed that up with his big comeback. But Edward isn't your usual hero. He goes on a binge, separates himself from the world before he can start becoming a better man. There's this alcohol-induced dream sequence we get where Edward's old friends urge him to change course before it's too late. And I still remember how cool it was when we learn in this sequence why his ship is called the Jackdaw. In an Aesop fable, the jackdaw is the bird that deludes itself into thinking it could be an eagle. And that's just such a wonderful way to describe Edward here, at this point in the game. Edward grows slowly, and it takes him years to make even the slightest hints of progress. He is charismatic from the start, but near the end of the game, everyone from Adewale to the player themselves is begging him to stop running his life into the ground. I don't mind how the Templars are rushed at the end of the game because to me, the story was never building up to Edward killing the Templar Grandmaster. It was never a primary focus of the game. Instead, the true climactic turning point of the story is when Adewale picks Edward up from oblivion and he decides that the man who abandoned Caroline Scott all those years ago because he was frightened of seeing himself as nothing was not the man he was going to be anymore. When he decides to change. Where other games showcase the end of a hero's journey with them defeating the evil villain, AC4 ends with Edward waiting by the pier to give a little girl a flower. An act that does not imply absolution because he can't undo the things he's done, but a readiness to live a new life, one where he doesn't make the same mistakes again. I love Ezio, but no other protagonist in this franchise gets this much time dedicated to their personal growth, and no other character is allowed to be this layered and complex. There is a reason I gave Edward the top spot in my character ranking video, not Ezio. Now, do I think this is Red Dead 2 levels of storytelling? Perhaps not. But it is a level of character development and focus that no other game in this series has come close to achieving. Instead of the macro lens of the world exploding in a ball of fire if the good guys don't win, AC4 takes it down to the micro level. How do the themes and philosophy of Assassin's Creed apply to one man who has the potential to be better than he is? Again, I get that that's not your usual kill every Templar type of story, and if you feel like this strays too far from that, I can't blame you. But from my perspective, this game treats the history it portrays with respect, it treats the lore of this franchise with respect, And most importantly, it treats its own characters with respect in ways that had never been seen in this franchise before or since. If there were only one thing you took away from my opinion of this game, I would want it to be that. They just don't make them like Edward anymore. And if we're talking about Ubisoft specifically, I don't really know that they ever did. Here at the end of this video, we've drifted a bit from the original question. Is this a good Assassin's Creed game? And yeah, I think it is. I think it cares about the lore, I think it shows respect to the roots of the franchise, and I think it gives us better stealth assassin content than most other AC games, no matter how much fantastic pirate content is also layered next to it. But at the same time, this is just such a fantastic, well-rounded game that to try and analyze its individual parts instead of the sum of them feels like a disservice. In a franchise full of titles that fall short of greatness because of clearly cut corners and rushed dev cycles, there is so much effort that you can feel in Black Flag, from the quality of the presentation, to the breadth of the content, to the detail every character gets. I didn't even get the chance to talk about the multiplayer component, which as of 2025 is still the most up-to-date way to play Assassin's Creed multiplayer, nor the weird meta modern-day segments that are a whole, honestly not very impactful can of worms. There is just so much in this game, and all of it is clean and polished, making me wonder how the heck this team managed to make all their ideas a reality, and what goes wrong with all the other AC games that can't seem to do the same. AC4 is everything it wants to be, and it is all the more beautiful for it. Now, am I saying it has to be everything you want it to be? Of course not. This is a complicated franchise, and you are within your rights to want things that this game doesn't decide to lean on. But to say it doesn't do justice to Assassin's Creed, when it puts more effort into its historical setting, the assassins, stealth, and the open world gameplay than most AC games, even at that time, that just doesn't sit right with me. I think Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag is a masterpiece, not in spite of the franchise it comes from, not if you just don't account for the franchise it comes from, but a masterpiece within this franchise. Because this, to me, is what a great Assassin's Creed game looks like. That's all I have for today. I know I haven't put out a video in a while, and I actually had some people reach out to ask if I'm okay. If you do happen to care, I've been more than okay. I've had a lot of good things happening in my life and in my career, and unfortunately that has meant I've had to slow down on the videos for a bit, but I'm happy to put one out again, because YouTube is a very fun hobby, and I like having this community with you all. My indie game of the month, or I guess last 3 months, is Nine Sols, which was a brutal game, but I loved it, and I just had to shout it out after enduring the pain that was the final boss. If you know what it is, then you know what it is. Definitely a must for Metroidvania or Souls fans out there, but maybe when you're done with Silksong. Anyways, feel free to chat with me about AC4 in the comments below, or email me at sosaysj@gmail.com, or you can message me on Patreon, which is only $1. I try to respond anywhere, so long as you're civil. That's all. Have a great day, and take care of yourself.
Good night and joy be with you all. Good night and joy